Can you imagine Red Bull's fate in 2025 being in the hands of a hidden flaw that only Verstappen could have detected? He discovered it himself, silently, on a random night inside the simulator. But what he found is so serious that it put the entire team in jeopardy. Before we continue, tell me in the comments, is Red Bull losing its dominance by not listening to Max? What exactly did Verstappen see that left Christian Horner completely shocked? Today we're going to analyze the biggest technical crisis Red Bull has faced since Max Verstappen became its star driver, and how a discovery in the simulator could change everything. Max Verstappen didn't simply finish the Monaco Grand Prix annoyed. He was visibly frustrated, restless, and with an attitude that revealed something deeper than a disappointing race. Fourth place isn't a catastrophe, but for someone like Max, accustomed to dominating, it was a wake-up call. And it wasn't an emotional reaction in the heat of the moment. It was the kind of reaction that comes when you know the problem isn't a one-off, but a structural one. He didn't make explosive statements to the press. There were no shouts on the radio or post-race controversy. What happened was much quieter, more calculated, and more worrying for Red Bull. Max decided to return to the simulator. Alone. Without cameras. Without noise, without filters. Because something wasn't right. Because there were details in the car's behavior that didn't correspond with what he felt on the track. In Milton Keynes, during the nights following the Grand Prix, Max locked himself in with the simulation engineers. They reviewed lap by lap. He focused on the long stints. He studied the telemetry as if looking for a needle in a haystack. And he found it. What he discovered was more than just an anomaly. It was a trend. A persistent irregularity that explained why, at certain moments, the car stopped behaving as it should. Suddenly, it lost the rear axle. It became unstable, and it did so without warning, as if the car had a second personality, a less reliable one. These kinds of findings are not common. They don't appear on a timesheet or a leaderboard. Only someone with Verstappen's sensitivity, with his pinpoint level of trust in the car, can detect it. It's not a general lack of grip. It's something more technical, more specific. A sudden loss of downforce on the rear axle, the result of a floor design that doesn't respond well when the car is outside its ideal height. That's what alarmed him. The RB21 had too narrow an operating window. And every time he went outside that range, whether due to fuel, tire wear, or track temperature, it became a trap. And for Verstappen, that's unacceptable. Not only because it complicates driving, but because it prevents building confidence. And without confidence, you don't win championships. The car wasn't unpredictable all the time. But when it was truly unpredictable. And that was enough to turn a race win into a wasted opportunity. Exactly what happened in Monaco. The important thing here isn't just what he discovered, but how he discovered it. While other teams used general data, Max went into detail. And that level of depth is only achieved by drivers who aren't willing to leave anything to chance. The magnitude of what Verstappen discovered cannot be underestimated. Because it wasn't just a loss of performance in certain scenarios. It was a structural vulnerability that compromised the entire design of the RB21. And the most alarming thing is that it wasn't a problem visible from the outside. It didn't show up directly in the lap times. It wasn't registered as a fault. It only manifested itself in the handling, in those tenths of a second when the car simply stopped responding as it should. Max, with his level of sensitivity on the track, is one of the few drivers who can identify such a fault. Not because it's an obvious sensation, but because it's a minimal, almost imperceptible disconnection that completely transforms the way a high-speed corner is taken. A slight slippage, a micro airflow that isn't channeled properly, a balance that changes from one lap to the next with no apparent logical explanation. For the average person, it goes unnoticed. For Verstappen, it's unacceptable. That sudden aerodynamic loss not only jeopardized the driver's confidence, it also increased the risk of making mistakes. Because when a car reacts differently to the same driver input, it's not just grip that's disrupted, it's the communication between man and machine that's disrupted. And that, in Formula One, is lethal. When Verstappen brought this finding to the team, he did so expecting action. But what he encountered was resistance. Instead of mobilizing urgently, the technical department asked for more simulations. More data. More time. This, in the middle of a season where every tenth counts and where McLaren was already gaining an advantage. And that's where the real conflict began. Because Max wasn't complaining. He was warning of a problem that could cost him a championship. And the response was lukewarm, bureaucratic. Adrian Newey's departure at the beginning of the year had left a technical leadership vacuum that had yet to be filled. Without him, decisions were slower, processes were more complex, and the risks were less acceptable. For a driver like Verstappen, that's frustrating. He's not racing to finish third. He's not at Red Bull waiting for solutions. He's here to win. And if the team doesn't act with the same urgency as he does, an inevitable disconnect ensues. Not just technically, but emotionally. The final straw was when Max learned that the engineers had known about the failure for some time. Not in detail as he described it, but enough to have addressed it. When Max Verstappen presented his discovery to the team, he did so clearly. It wasn't a suggestion, nor just another technical comment. It was an urgent warning. The RB21 had a structural defect. And if it wasn't resolved, Red Bull wouldn't just lose races. It would lose the championship. But what he found wasn't an immediate response. It wasn't swift action or an aggressive strategy. What he found was silence, doubt, caution, and that raised an even greater alarm. Because if there's one thing Verstappen can't tolerate, it's passivity when it comes to competing at the highest level. In the corridors of Milton Keynes, the atmosphere became tense. Technicians and directors knew Max was right, but they also knew that the team's internal structure had changed. Adrian Newey was no longer at the helm, overseeing every technical decision with undisputed authority. His departure left a void, a space that, until that moment, no one had fully filled. And that void was noticeable. Instead of acting immediately on the aerodynamic failure, the team decided to gather more data, running more simulations, confirming the theory with virtual models. It was a cautious approach, too cautious by Verstappen's standards. Because in Formula One, when you wait for absolute certainty, you're already one step behind. The situation escalated quickly. Max didn't voice it publicly. He didn't need to. Within the team, his discontent was palpable. The technical meetings became more tense. The simulator sessions, more private. And Verstappen's body language in every session of the weekend was clear. He had lost confidence in the direction of development. That was when a critical meeting was called. A closed meeting, no cameras, no external advisors, no press. Just the main players, Verstappen, Christian Horner, the senior engineers, and a tension that could have been cut in the air. What happened in that room was the closest thing to a direct confrontation that Red Bull has experienced in recent years. Max didn't raise his voice. He didn't give a dramatic speech. He was tougher than that. He was precise, cold, undeniable. He told them exactly what he thought, that they'd known for a long time, that they hadn't acted, and that he wasn't willing to wait while the championship slipped through their fingers. The phrase that defined the meeting was simple, but devastating. This isn't how you win championships. It wasn't just a criticism. It was a statement of principles, a line the driver drew for the entire team. Either they reacted, or they would lose everything they had built together. Because if Red Bull had dominated in previous years, it wasn't by waiting. It was by attacking, by innovating, by taking calculated risks. And now, they were paralyzed by the fear of making mistakes. From that meeting on, priorities shifted. The engineers began working under new instructions. The fault Max identified became the main focus of development. And although the results weren't immediate, the team's pace changed. Because now they knew they weren't just fighting McLaren. They were fighting against time, and against the mistrust that had been sown within the garage itself. The pressure on the technical departments multiplied. There was no longer any room for error. Every new part had to be effective. Every simulation validated on the track. Because Max would no longer issue second warnings. The message had been made clear. It was either act or disappear from the championship fight. This internal fracture, silent but profound, was the true consequence of Verstappen's discovery. It wasn't just an aerodynamic failure. It was a warning sign of something more serious. The team had stopped functioning with the agility of a champion. And if they didn't recover that momentum, they could lose much more than a season. While Red Bull tried to find stability amidst the chaos, McLaren moved forward with surgical precision. Every technical decision they made in recent months wasn't just right, it was strategic. They weren't looking to make the perfect car. They wanted a reliable car, one that could perform in multiple scenarios. And that, in an unpredictable season like 2025, is pure gold. Red Bull's RB21 works. That's true, but it does so only within a narrow range. It needs ideal conditions, perfect temperature, precise tire pressure, fuel level fine-tuned, a clean track, no crosswinds, no corners that are too slow. When any of that changes, even slightly, the car begins to break down. Not catastrophically, but in a subtle but lethal way. Balance is lost, confidence evaporates, and performance plummets. In contrast, McLaren's MCL39 was designed with a different philosophy. Wider, more open, with greater tolerances. Oscar Piastri and Lando Norris can attack corners without fear of the car reacting differently on every lap, because their car simply behaves the same under pressure, and that allows them to drive more aggressively, more precisely, more consistently. The key difference isn't top speed. It's confidence. Red Bull forces its driver to adapt every lap. McLaren gives its drivers a stable platform that allows them to focus on maximizing pace without worrying about the rear axle breaking down in the middle of a medium-speed corner. McLaren team principal Andrea Stella explained it best. The key is thermal management. They aren't trying to make the car faster at a single point during the weekend. They're building a car that works throughout the race. One that manages the tires intelligently, doesn't punish the rear compounds, and maintains its performance even in changing track conditions. It's the approach of a long-term champion, not a qualifying hero. And that approach is working. Piastri leads the championship. Norris is close behind. Both extract the maximum from the car at each circuit without the need for perfect tuning, because the car adapts to them, not the other way around. That's the big difference. In contrast, Red Bull relies solely on Verstappen, because he's the only one capable of taking the RB21 out of its danger zone. But even he's reaching his limits. And when the driver needs to focus on keeping the car stable, he ceases to be a real threat to rivals who can simply focus on being faster. Yuki Tsunoda, driving the same car, has only scored 7 points so far this season. Not because he doesn't know how to drive, but because the car doesn't forgive mistakes. And that says more about the RB21 than the second driver. McLaren, on the other hand, has two drivers competing against each other, validating the data, pushing the car to the limit without exceeding it. Red Bull has one driver and one co-driver. The result is visible in the numbers. McLaren leads the Constructors' Championship with 374 points. Red Bull is fourth, just shy of 162. The gap is no longer a trend. It's a reality, and it's a reality that widens every weekend. The most dangerous thing for Red Bull isn't losing races. It's losing the ability to learn quickly. Because while they're trying to get the car working again within their narrow margin, McLaren is expanding theirs. And that gives them freedom. Freedom to experiment, to race without fear, to innovate without jeopardizing the result. What began as a quiet frustration in the simulator has morphed into a full-blown crisis within Red Bull. Max Verstappen encountered a technical fault that, by itself, can explain the collapse of a team that until recently seemed unbeatable. It wasn't a rumor. It wasn't speculation. It was a meticulous detection by the most dominant driver of the modern era, who now faces not only rivals on the track, but a system that has stopped listening. The RB21 is fast. No one denies it. But it's also unstable, fragile, and conditioned to such a precise balance that it becomes a trap for anyone other than Max. And that makes it a double-edged sword. Because when everything goes right, it remains competitive. But when a single variable changes, the car stops working. And that is the greatest danger for any team aspiring to dominate. The data is devastating. Verstappen has scored 95% of Red Bull's points. His teammate is almost irrelevant in the standings. And in front of them, McLaren. Two drivers. Two sources of information. An adaptable car. A team that doesn't hesitate, that acts, and that has already built a lead that Red Bull won't be able to reduce if it doesn't change its approach right now. Time is ticking. The next races will be crucial. Austria, Silverstone, circuits that demand precision and adaptability. If the RB21 doesn't respond there, if the updates don't fix the fundamental flaws, it won't just be more points that will be lost. The narrative will be lost. The control. And perhaps, even, the bond between Red Bull and Verstappen. Because this is no ordinary driver. He's a 4-time world champion who has proven he knows how to spot problems before the data confirms them. So the big question isn't whether Red Bull can improve the car. It's whether it can regain the commitment of its leader. Because right now, beyond the floor design or the aerodynamic windows, what's at stake is the connection between a team and its driver. And now I want to know your opinion. Will the planned technical improvements be enough? Can they resolve the internal imbalance and give Verstappen a car he can trust again? Leave your answer in the comments. And if you're interested in keeping up with everything that happens behind the scenes in Formula One with in-depth, unfiltered analysis, be sure to subscribe.